Hi, Lindenwood class. We are going to complete our story of the Odyssey today. As promised, here's the last installment in our story. We have followed Odysseus on his way home to Ithaca from Troy. He's been gone many years fighting, and then was gone many more years just trying to get home. Because as we know, he did not make a friend of Poseidon. And so the sea was not his friend. And he had bad luck after bad luck. And he found himself now on the last leg of his journey. And so that is where we are going to pick up with our hero, Odysseus. And we're going to see what happens when and if he gets back to Ithaca to his son Telemachus and his wife Penelope. So let's pick up and see what happens next. Now, when we left Odysseus, he had been in his ship and there had been a terrible storm. And that storm had destroyed his ship and drowned his crew. And Odysseus himself found himself washed ashore on a land he knew not where. With all of his strength, he scrambled up onto the beach next to a river that was flowing out into the sea and managed to get himself into the protection of some bushes before he fell fast asleep. While he was sleeping, the princess on the island came down to the river with her maidens, and she and her maidens were playing ball and laughing and shrieking, and their shrieks grew louder when their ball fell into the pool of the river. And they got very close to the bushes where, unknown to them, slept our hero Odysseus. The shrieks of the women woke Odysseus, and you can just imagine how startled and scared they were to see a man they'd never seen before come out of the bushes, out of seemingly nowhere. The princess, however, kept calm and asked the right questions about who this stranger was. And Odysseus, ever the hero and ever the charmer, told the princess how lovely she was and wanted to know whether she was a goddess or whether she was a human mortal. The princess took him to her father when he had told her that his crew had all been drowned, because this island was inhabited by a seafaring people who had great respect for those lost at sea. Well, when Odysseus got to the king and told the king that he was none other than Lord Odysseus of Ithaca, who had lately fought in the wars of Troy, the king spared no expense in outfitting a boat that was fit with robes and riches and food for a journey so that Odysseus could return safely to Ithaca. And so this ship carries Odysseus back to the rocky shores of the island of Ithaca. And after 20 years away, you can only imagine, right, what he must have looked like. Not much like the man who had left 20 years before. And he was in no way certain of what had happened in the 20 years since he had been home. He didn't know what kind of welcome he would receive. And so he takes the boat with its crew to a quiet harbor away from the town. There he hid his sea chest of riches that the people on the island had given him in a secret cave, and he wrapped himself in beggar's rags. Now, wearing his disguise, he climbed up a rough path, and he came to a part of the island where pigs were kept. And as he approached the hut of the pig's keeper, some fierce dogs rushed out at him. They were about to tear at his limbs. Fine welcome home. But just in time, the keeper appeared and called them off. "You should be more careful," he scolded, "for the gods would be angry with me if my dogs ripped apart an innocent stranger, if you are indeed an innocent stranger." Well, Odysseus recognized the man as his old servant, Eumaeus. He was a good man, and he honored the Greek tradition of giving food and shelter to strangers. In fact, in the Greek language, there was just one word for both stranger and guest, because all strangers should be honored as guests. That night the two men sat up talking, and Eumaeus explained that his master was King Odysseus, who had been away for 20 years and was almost certainly dead by now, but that his loyal wife, Queen Penelope, would not believe that her husband was dead. However, his palace, Odysseus's palace, was filled with scoundrels who ate his food and drank his wine, and they all were there in hopes that Penelope would pick one of them to marry, because they were all convinced that Odysseus was never coming back, and they wanted to take King Odysseus's place. In fact, at this point, they had been in the palace so long that they were demanding that Penelope pick one of them to marry. Penelope, however, refused. She told them that she could not marry anyone until she had finished sewing her wedding dress. Penelope was a great weaver and a great seamstress, and all day and all night, all day she worked weaving the cloth for her wedding dress, and all night, under cover of darkness, where none of the suitors could see her, she unpicked all of her work, so that each morning she was no further to completing the wedding dress than she had been the day before. Her son, Prince Telemachus, had taken a ship and left Ithaca to go in search of his father, but he had found no news. He was expected home any day now. The suitors of Penelope had set up a watch down by the harbor, and they planned to ambush and to murder the prince as soon as he reached the shore. Now Odysseus listened to all of this, but he didn't tell Eumaeus who he was. The next morning, the swineherd pointed him on the road to town. Odysseus set out, and on his way, he met Prince Telemachus, who was smart enough to take a back route home and not put into port where these suitors would have been expecting him. The two men walked along, a beggar and a prince, side by side. Athena, the wise goddess, made Odysseus appear as his true self, younger, stronger, and richly dressed. And Telemachus was amazed. He realized that this sudden transformation must be the work of a god or a goddess. And he understood that the man standing next to him was his father, who had left him as a baby. Well, now after they had embraced one another a long time, they hatched a plan. Telemachus would return to the palace alone, and Odysseus would follow on, dressed as a beggar, and accompanied by Eumaeus. No matter how many insults his wife's suitors flung at him, they would keep their tempers until the moment was ripe for revenge. Later that day, Odysseus and the swineherd did indeed approach the town. On the way, they were met by a man they both knew, a servant who kept the goats. When he saw the two shabbily dressed men, he called out, "Well, look what we have here. One piece of filth sticking to another piece of filth. Old pig keeper, what are you taking that garbage to the palace for? All he'll get there is a sound beating." Well, Odysseus was sorely tempted to batter the man, but he knew he must keep his temper. So he and the loyal swineherd walked past. Not far from the town there was a pile of dung and rubbish. Lying on top of it was a sad old dog who'd been cast out of the palace by the suitors. The dog's name was Argos, and in his prime he had been a fine hunting dog, the favorite of Odysseus. Now he was all but broken, but the moment that Odysseus came near, he sensed his master's scent. He lifted his muzzle from the dung heap and thumped his tail. Odysseus saw him and went over to his faithful animal and patted him on the head. Argos licked his master's hand and was happy for the first time in many years. A few moments later, he breathed his last. Now inside the palace, Eumaeus and Odysseus find the suitors all feasting. Odysseus went round the table begging for scraps of food. Some of the suitors threw him some scraps, but the leader of the suitors was more cruel. He turned to the swineherd and asked, "Keeper of pigs, why did you drag this old corpse into our dining room? Don't we have enough beggars and pests in this town? Kindly throw him out before I do something terrible to him." Well, Eumaeus replied, "My lord Odysseus was always kind and respectful to old soldiers who were down on their luck. It is his food and wine that you are helping yourself to, and he would gladly spare a few morsels." Well, at this, the leader of the suitors fell into a rage. "Fine words, swineherd," he said, "but this is what I think of your advice." And with that, he picked up a chair and flung it at Odysseus, and it hit him on the shoulder. All the suitors burst into laughter and started to pelt Odysseus and the swineherd with food. They both kept their cool, and they retreated further into the palace. Eumaeus found the old nurse who had looked after Odysseus as a baby. He said that the stranger was weary from tramping and asked if she would bathe his feet. She gladly fetched hot water and began to do as she was asked. As she watched him, as she washed his feet, she could not help but notice a scar on the stranger's leg. Odysseus had gone out hunting as a young man, and the boar had charged at him and dug its tusk into his leg. She recognized the scar from this attack at once. "My lord," she said, "you are home at last. Let me rush to your poor queen and let her know this wonderful news." "Hold still," said Odysseus. "One of the servants might hear her rejoicing, and my secret will be out. Don't breathe a word to a soul, not even to fair Penelope." The good old nurse swore that she would keep her master's secret, and as he walked back along the corridor, a maid spat at him and told him to get out of the palace with his begging bowl. Now that evening, as Odysseus was sitting on the porch of the palace, along came a real beggar, Iris, and he was a complete scoundrel, a cheat, and a sneaky thief. He was a favorite of the suitors, who recognized him as a kindred spirit. Iris was not pleased to see a rival beggar in his place, competing with him for scraps. "Get up and get out," he told Odysseus. "Make yourself scarce before I box you around the ears." "What's gotten into you?" replied Odysseus. "I've done you no harm. You'd better keep your mouth shut, or you'll be on the wrong end of a beating." "Are you threatening me, old man?" said Iris. "Well, stand up so I can punch your lights out." Now, one of the suitors overheard the two old tramps quarreling and thought it was hilarious. He ordered them to come inside so that the suitors could enjoy the spectacle of a beggar's boxing match. A space was cleared in the middle of the dining hall. The suitors placed bets on which tramp would knock the other out first. Iris was the clear favorite to win, but then the two men stripped down for the fight. Odysseus's muscles glistened, and all could see that he was built like an ox. Iris began to tremble with fear, but it was too late. The leader of the suitors, whose name was Antinous, swiftly changed his wager back to the newcomer. He called out to Iris, "You've filled your fat belly with scraps from our table, old goat that you are, but now it seems you're going to get what's coming to you." Odysseus hit Iris with a glancing blow, and he was out cold. The servants dragged him out by his feet and threw him on the dung heap beside the corpse of old Argos. The suitors gave Odysseus his reward for the victory, scraps of meat from their plates. Antinous said to Odysseus, "That was a good hit from an old swine like you, but don't get any ideas or get above yourself and your station. You'll soon be out on your ear." Well, later that night, Odysseus and Prince Telemachus held a secret conference. This is what Odysseus told his son to do. he must tell his mother to call all the suitors together and tell them that she had made up her mind to hold an archery contest. She would marry the man who could string her husband's old bow and shoot the straightest arrow from it. Penelope agreed to this idea because she knew that the only man who was strong enough to string her husband's bow was her husband himself. She thought the contest was a cunning way to show the suitors that not a single one among them was an equal of her husband. The next morning, the suitors gathered in the dining hall for the contest. They set up a target at the end of the room, and Telemachus handed his father's great bow to the first to try his aim. The suitor could not even bend the bow, let alone fire it. And the others all laughed at him for being so feeble, but not for long, for none of them had the strength to bend the bow either, or string it. At last their leader, Antinous, took it in his hands, and though he could bend it just a bit, he was far from able to hook the string over its end. "There, Penelope must be laughing up in her chamber," he said. "A fine trick this is of hers, for there's no man alive who could string this bow." And then Odysseus said, "I was once handy with a bow and arrow. I pray let me try my hand." Well, the suitors all laughed at the tramp's boast, but Antinous said, "Certainly, if you string the bow for me, I will reward you with gold. If not, I shall beat you within an inch of your life." At this, Odysseus picked up the bow, and tried it for weight, balancing it in his hand. And the suitors mocked him for this display. "Thinks he's an expert, he does. Ha, ha, ha," right? They're all jeering at him. But then he places the bow upright on the ground. And he leaned into it and hooked the string over the end with ease. At first, the suitors were astounded, and then they realized that the beggar was the king whose palace and hospitality they had been abusing, and whose wife they had been wooing. The realization came too late to save their skins, for Odysseus was soon letting arrows fly from the bow, picking them off one by one. One of the suitors, who was better mannered than the other, tried to bargain with the king. He swore that if he would spare their lives, they would pay him back 3 times over for what they had taken. Odysseus replied that if they wanted to save their lives, they had better fight. Several men charged at him with their swords, but Odysseus was swift at letting the arrows fly. And so Odysseus and his son Telemachus dealt with all the suitors. At the end of the battle, not one was left alive. And now Odysseus told his son to fetch Penelope. And when Penelope saw her husband, she couldn't be sure, after so many years, that it was really him. "Dearest queen, how can you be so hard-hearted when you see your husband here before you after 20 long years?" asked Odysseus. Penelope still was not sure whether or not to believe her own eyes, so she decided to test him. She called the old nurse and told her to move the bed out of their room and prepare it for the stranger in the next room along the corridor. "How can that be?" asked Odysseus. "If it is my bed, then nobody could move it, for I made it myself, and one of its pillars is the olive tree that grew on this spot where I built the bedroom with my own hands." Then Penelope knew that the man before her was truly her husband Odysseus, for whom she had waited 20 long years. And that's the story of the homecoming of Odysseus. It's also the end of the tales from the Trojan War, as told by the Greek bard and poet Homer, who wrote 2 long epic poems about them, called the Iliad and the Odyssey. Although our hero was overjoyed to be home, that was not the end of his travels. For Odysseus always longed to go and see new places, and after some time he again set out. The English poet, Lord Alfred Tennyson, in a poem called Ulysses, which is another name for Odysseus, wrote a few lines about his unquenchable urge to sail the sea, and we'll end with those. "For my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles whom we knew. Though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. I'll see you all on Tuesday.